Welcome to the debate. The current conflict in Gaza, well, it's really thrown a spotlight on discussions around post-war reconstruction. And some of the proposals emerging are, frankly, they're audacious. They speak not just to rebuilding, but to a complete, transformative restructuring of the territory's economy.
Yes. And the scale, the sheer ambition of these plans, it really demands intense scrutiny, doesn't it? They're so disruptive, so totalizing, that they force us to ask fundamental questions about the ultimate purpose behind the current conflict itself. We have to look beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis or the military actions.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our central question today. We're debating the real motivation behind these proposals to redevelop Gaza into, well, potentially a luxury hub, a deep-water port, a major trade nexus. Is this, as all argue, driven by immediate, opportunistic geopolitical economics, basically a modern land grab for quick regional profit and influence? Or does it represent something deeper, an explicit, decades-old agenda of, let's say, hidden Western power structures? Maybe even viewing this conflict as a modern crusade or something tied to, well, prophetic allegory? I'm taking the position that this is primarily modern economic opportunism, leveraging a crisis for short-term gains and regional competition.
And I'll be arguing the opposite, that what we're seeing represents a much deeper, long-standing agenda, one orchestrated by interconnected elite groups whose goal is fundamentally the systemic restructuring of global power and the allocation of resources, using conflict as, perhaps, an engineered catalyst.
Okay, so let's start with the economics then. Because the proposals currently floating around, including some pretty aggressive concepts like the Gaza Riviera idea, they seem fundamentally driven by identifiable high-value financial outcomes. These aren't vague blueprints. They are detailed financial models. We've seen projections estimating a, frankly, staggering asset value of around $320 billion within just 10 years. And that's based on creating a huge tourism industry, perhaps $3 billion a year, needing 30, maybe 40 luxury hotels. To me, this screams raw hyper-capitalist extraction.
I grant you the numbers are huge, yes. But the very nature of this intervention, the rapid unilateral seizure and redevelopment of such a strategic piece of land after a conflict that fits perfectly within the documented methods of certain influential global bodies, we have to consider organizations mentioned in the source material, like the Committee of 300 or the Club of Rome. Their documented mandates revolve around global planning, resource control, and ultimately, technocratic administration.
But the evidence for economic opportunism is so specific, so immediate. Look at how these plans integrate with existing infrastructure rivalries. They explicitly call for building a deep port and a vital rail hub. Why? To serve as a major connection point for the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. I mean, this is a clear 21st century geopolitical play. It's about making Gaza competitive with established hubs like Dubai or Abu Dhabi. It feels much more about trade routes, logistics, maybe tariffs, than ancient prophecies.
Okay. I see the point about the IMEC connection. Its immediate utility is obvious, but I think interpreting it only through that lens is too narrow. That scale of planning, so disruptive, so sudden, and focused squarely on controlling resources, it's characteristic of a technocratic agenda that's been developing for decades. Take the Club of Rome, for instance, an international think tank founded by elites and, according to the sources, explicitly directed by NATO at one point to develop social programs. Figures linked to it, like Harlan Cleveland, who was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, were involved in preparing some quite cynical reports, frankly, on things like population triage in the developing world.
And the documented strategy of using limited wars to seize natural resources. Think about the planning around the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, reportedly conducted by Meadows and Forrester for the RIA, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, specifically to control petroleum supplies. It suggests this current potential land grab is just the latest execution of that same long-term, zero-growth, technotronic agenda. just applied now to the Gaza coastline.
Let's drill down into the mechanics of this proposed extraction, though. The Gaza 2035 plan, as outlined, focuses heavily on return on investment. It anticipates something like $185 billion in revenue over 10 years. And crucially, it includes relocation incentives, $55,000 per family for those who permanently move outside Gaza. The capitalist motivation seems undeniable here, maximizing commercial value through construction, tourism, data centers, that strategic port. The sheer amount of planned investment, $133 billion over 10 years. That's hard evidence of a primary economic driver, isn't it? It's not just theory, it looks like a pro forma balance sheet.
But the structure of that balance sheet is exactly what gives me pause. The plan's emphasis on these sophisticated, high-tech smart cities, on large-scale data centers, coupled with the mass displacement of possibly 90,000 families, that perfectly mirrors the Club of Rome's vision for a technotronic era. This is a framework designed explicitly to allocate and manage resources through global planning executed by a small elite. And when you look at the source material on, say, the Committee of 300, you find descriptions of these plutocrats historically financing wars, controlling illicit trade, using major banks like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank not just for profit, but for systemic money laundering and control.
So you're saying if the goal is just raw profit, then the $185 billion is the end game. But if the goal is systemic control, then the smart city infrastructure, the data centers, they're just the means to that end.
Precisely. The economic revenue isn't the ultimate goal. It's the vehicle, perhaps even the cover story. That deep port isn't just about shipping containers. It could potentially serve as a Western Allied naval facility that secures not just global commercial routes, but also security domination for this established elite network.
Okay, but you're proposing that modern, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, data centers needing massive fiber optic grids, 21st century computing power are primarily motivated by an agenda stretching back centuries, back to the Crusades even? I find that, well, a significant leap. How do we bridge that gap between specific, measurable modern economic planning and the concept of, say, a hidden continuation of the Crusades or Templar goals?
We bridge it by recognizing the continuity of power structures. We have to at least consider the possibility that these elite groups view current events as part of a very long historical project. The sources document an enduring power structure linked to, for example, the British Crown, specifically identifying the Knights of the Order of the Garter as leaders within the Committee of 300. We also see references to organizations like the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, linked to powerful figures like Sir Brian Edward Mountain, described as subverted yet still highly influential institutions.
But what specific evidence connects, say, the Knights of the Garter today to a competitive bid for a port linked to the IMEC corridor? That feels like a missing link.
Their historical mandate, arguably, has always been the control of strategic territories, and the Levant has historically been chief among them. These established organizations, these orders, represent the continuation of historical power networks. They are documented as using sophisticated intelligence operations, MI6, the RIA, the Roundtable Network, to influence global policy, including U.S. policy. So the current conflict, aiming for strategic economic and security dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean, it could simply be the latest operation executed by these historical orders acting as perhaps modern equivalents of crusaders or successors to groups like the Knights Templar. They're arguably protecting a centuries-old interest, not just reacting to a current market opportunity or budget cycle.
I have to challenge the direct relevance of that historical framing, though. The conflict's origins, as documented in the source material itself, seem firmly rooted in 20th century geopolitics and competing national interests, not millennia-old secret society mandates. The 1917 Balfour Declaration, which arguably set this whole process in motion, was driven by very clear Allied propagandist needs during World War I, specifically the need to rally global Jewish support for the Allied cause. Subsequent events, the 1948 war, the more recent Gaza conflicts, are explained by these competing national narratives, shifts in regional power dynamics. Now, while high-level think tanks like the RIA certainly exist, and yes, manipulate political information and fund groups,
Their documented activities seem to fit more comfortably as highly effective political maneuvering within the existing nation-state system, not the fulfillment of some ancient esoteric crusade mandate.
I understand that perspective, but the distinction might be subtle yet critical. The very use of these historical orders, the continuity suggested, points towards a powerful group committed to a unified, long-term historical trajectory. Perhaps they name their projects or frame their actions using classical power structures precisely because that's how they conceive of their own long-term purpose as the rightful continuing architects of the global system.
Okay, that leads us directly to the role of prophecy and this ideological framing, specifically the idea of the 10 kingdoms that comes up in the sources. The incorporation of these prophetic interpretations, like the evangelical pre-millennial dispensationalist views of Gog and Magog attacking Israel, or the biblical references to 10 kingdoms from Daniel and Revelation, these seem like highly specific ideological frames. They're used by figures like Jack Chick and others, according to the material, to galvanize public support, shape geopolitical visions in places like the U.S., often predicting things like a World War III scenario resulting in the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. I would argue this ideological framing is a consequence, or perhaps a justification used by certain religious or political groups after the fact, seeking to fit events into a pre-existing prophetic narrative. It doesn't feel like the guiding strategy of Western policy itself.
That's a plausible explanation for the public-facing aspect of the ideology, certainly. But have you considered how these allegories might be utilized internally by the very groups we're discussing? H.G. Wells in the source material described his open conspiracy concept as a conscious organization of intelligent and in some cases wealthy men working towards a one-world government. For that kind of group, perhaps prophetic allegories serve a purely utilitarian organizational purpose.
Utilitarian? How so?
Well, the source material does note that governments and elites often use classic historical names or allegories for their projects. It lends a sense of authority, of historical permanence. So whether these prophecies are taken literally by some or used purely allegorically by others, the imagery, the 10 kingdoms, representing perhaps a confederacy emerging from the old Roman sphere, or the intense focus on Israel and Jerusalem, it serves as a potent long-term framework, a shorthand maybe for structuring eventual political and religious control. It reinforces their self-perception, perhaps, as the architects of a new world order, maybe one with unified religious and monetary systems. The allegory itself becomes the operational language for long-term global governance, providing a consistent narrative thread for projects that span decades, even centuries.
So let me try and synthesize this. You believe the construction of a luxury hub, a deep port, data centers on the Gaza coast, it's not primarily about getting immediate returns on beachfront real estate and logistics infrastructure. It's actually about positioning a key, highly controlled piece of infrastructure within an allegorically driven New World Order structure, orchestrated by groups like the Committee of 300, using frameworks like the 10 Kingdoms narrative.
I maintain that the economic data, the $185 billion revenue figure, could simply be the cost of doing business towards the ultimate goal, which is systemic, long-term control. This would then be the latest visible step in establishing a pervasive, technocratic global system, managed by these interconnected financial and political elites who perhaps view history not as random chance, but as a long project they're actively guiding. And they may well use the language of historical continuity, even prophecy, to motivate their followers and, potentially, disguise their true underlying aims.
Okay. We have certainly examined the current proposals for Gaza's reconstruction, and we've noted they're firmly supported by detailed financial projections, massive infrastructure, tourism, trade hubs, that critical deep port linked to the IMEC project. These facts strongly suggest a powerful motivation rooted in immediate, opportunistic economic leverage during a political vacuum, specifically aiming to compete, maybe even surpass, regional financial powers.
And we have also highlighted the potential connections, profound connections perhaps, between global conflicts and these powerful, long-standing structures like the Committee of 300 and the Club of Rome.
Their documented goals, as presented in the sources, do involve imposing technocratic control, managing resources, sometimes through manufactured crises, and viewing major geopolitical shifts through a historical lens, using allegories like the Ten Kingdoms or the idea of a continuous crusade possibly to justify and execute their systemic global restructuring projects.
The material definitely forces us to consider whether the destruction and proposed rebuilding of Gaza are, at their core, part of a cynical, short-term economic land grab driven by immediate profit forecasts, or if this is indeed the latest highly visible move in a much longer game, a game orchestrated by forces committed to deep, pervasive global control, perhaps even fulfilling their own sense of historical or prophetic destiny. There are clearly profound layers of motivation here, beneath the surface of official policy statements that warrant much further investigation.